So I want to tell you about, there you go, there's my beautiful cover that Ecco made. Thank you guys. So as Miriam mentioned, the 7 or 8 Deaths of Stella Fortuna is a 100-year family saga. It spans 2 world wars, emigration to the United States from southern Italy, and all of the difficulties of a dual identity, both as an Italian and an American, and also as a woman and a human being, which in the middle of the 20th century could be a really difficult thing, especially I think if you were coming from a very patriarchal place like southern Italy. And the story is told through the lens of these 2 sisters, Stella and Tina. They are best friends. They're a year apart in age. Tina is a good girl. She's obedient. She's a little bit stupid. Her older sister, Stella, is really smart and charismatic and pretty and cursed. So the book is told through the 7 or 8 times that Stella Fortuna is almost killed in some kind of very bizarre accident. I just want to say, on a personal note, this is a book that I've wanted to write since I was about 8 years old. So seeing it finally come to fruition is really, really cool for me. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the background here. First of all, this is where Calabria is. And I don't blame you if you don't know about Calabria, because it's not the best known part of Italy. It is in the deep, deep south. There are a lot of Calabrian Americans, but people don't really go there. It's not a tourist destination, although it is incredibly beautiful. I'm going to show you 3 photos that I took in Calabria, and I'm really famously a terrible photographer. It's so beautiful that even I can take photos of it. So it's a very ancient land. The Greeks first settled it almost 3,000 years ago. It is the home of the Odyssey. So this photo was taken in a city called Tropea, which is where Odysseus washes up and is saved by the princess Nausicaa in Homer's Odyssey. So like the history goes way back. It's known for its gorgeous little hilltop towns, like this one. And then here we go. This is Jevoli. This is the town where Stella Fortuna is born, a village, I should say. There's only like 200 people there. I took this photo in the church piazza overlooking 2 seas. You can see it's at the narrowest part of the peninsula, so you can see the Tyrrhenian and the Ionian at the same time. This is a rainstorm. I'm so in love with this place. It's so beautiful. But I will point out that the reason it's so high up in the mountains, like a lot of these other towns in Calabria, is because these towns were built defensively. So Calabria comes from the ancient Greek Calabria, which means fertile land. So basically for the last 2,000 years, raiders have come from all over the world and stripped away its natural resources, starting with the Romans, who came and took all of the timber. So the sad part of this story is that Calabria is very poor. This is a post-colonial story, and everything was basically taken away from the people there, especially by, most recently, the Spanish, who colonized it for 400 years brutally. They basically enslaved everyone. They made it impossible to own property. So then when Italy unified in 1860, everyone left. There was no opportunity for them there, and that's why we're all here in the States and all over the world. So this photo is from 1950. Sorry, it's so grainy. I found it on the internet. But it's an example of like why it was so backward in 1950. No running water, no electricity. This is 20 years after my own family had emigrated. So I can't even imagine what it would have been like to live there. But people did come to the States for opportunity. And this photo was actually taken in the city where my grandmother was born in the 1920s, so during the time when the book is set. You can see that the women are barefoot and they're wearing black. And so, I mean, it's just this gorgeous place with all these resources that has been beset upon by so many people for so long. And I think that that's why the people in Calabria have this deep-seated belief in the evil eye. Which is this Mediterranean concept. I see a lot of people nodding. So this exists in a lot of cultures in the Mediterranean, but it's this idea that if you have something really great, the people around you are going to be jealous of it. Even people who love you are going to want it, and their suppressed resentments develop into this miasma that can become a curse. laid on you. And evil eye belief is really still very prevalent in Calabria. I'm actually wearing my own charm right now, so I wear this everywhere, but not because I'm superstitious, or anything. So this is something really interesting coming out as I was writing Stella's story and wondering why she had so much bad luck. And I started to wonder, is this girl who has so much going for her, who's so smart and beautiful, is she maybe cursed? Anyway, so, just one more story. The thing about Calabria that's really interesting to me are the stories of the people that have been kind of lost in this whole dialogue about how poor and terrible it is. And I found a lot of these stories during my research, so I'm really happy to share a lot of them now. But I'm about to get really, really personal about why I wrote this story. Yeah, so on the left is my grandmother. Her name was Antoinette Cassano. She died just this summer at age 98. The person on the right is also, neither of us has really changed in the last 35 years, I gotta tell you. So my grandmother was a huge influence in my childhood. We're a tight-knit family, and she kind of raised me. Here is, this is from 1970. It's my mom on the far left over there, but these are her parents and godparents and brothers, and this is kind of what our upbringing was outside of Hartford, Connecticut, in an Italian enclave. And that's very much a part of my culture. And most importantly, this is my grandmother and her sister, my Aunt Connie. They were 1 year apart in age, much like the sisters in the book, which is maybe not coincidental. They were best friends their entire lives. They immigrated together. They married best friends. My aunt was unable to have children, and my grandmother had too many children, and so they raised them together. They shared the same backyard, and I grew up kind of thinking of both of them as my grandmother, and it was wonderful. Now, almost 50 years later, we have this photo. It's one of my favorites. So unfortunately, this is where things take a turn for the tragic. On the anniversary of her mother's death, my grandmother had an accident. We call it like the accident with a capital A, and she fell down her cellar stairs. And she wasn't found for several hours, and her brain started to swell and from a cerebral hemorrhage. So when they rushed her to the hospital, this is 1988, so at the time there was an experimental procedure that the doctors said they could try, where they would cut out a third of her frontal lobe. And when they did that, she would probably be a vegetable for the rest of her life if she survived the procedure at all. She would never walk or talk again. She would eat through a feeding tube. But my mother and all of her brothers got together and they found the funds to do this experimental procedure because they weren't gonna let mommy die, obviously. And the doctors were wrong. She made a miraculous recovery. She was 6 weeks later dancing at a wedding. They never believed that this could have happened. But the story is not entirely happy because with a lobotomy, things get messed up. And so when she woke up, a bunch of things were not correct anymore. She changed her birthday, which was very curious to everyone. She used to have a birthday of January 12th. She suddenly wanted her birthday to be January 11th. She would only wear red. She would always pick the wrong language. So if you were an English language speaker, she would address you in Italian and vice versa. And the worst thing by far is when she woke up from her coma, she would not speak to her sister and never spoke to her sister again until the day she died this summer. If you asked her why, she would say that her sister was evil, that her sister had put a curse on her, that her sister was jealous. But this is really hard to deal with someone with a medically altered brain. There was no reasoning with her, there was no argument, but it was really hurtful. I mean, this has been her best friend and her caretaker, who had spent their entire lives together, and my aunt was basically, shunned now, had lost her best friend too. So this was really difficult on the family. We started to have 2 separate Mother's Days, 2 separate Christmases, and 35 years pass, and you're taking care of this person who's medically altered, and I think her reputation started to change. People thought of my grandmother as difficult or as a problem. She needed to be taken care of. She was angry. She was mean. I think over time, basically the person she used to be was lost, and the memory of her was lost. So that was something that I always felt was off, that I wanted to correct. I first started thinking about writing my grandmother's story when I was really young. As I mentioned, I was probably 8 years old. And even at the time, I'm the oldest grandchild, so no one else can really remember what she was like before the accident. But I knew that I wanted to try to tell her story. The first time I ever tried to write a novel, I was on my dad's Amiga computer, if you remember those. I was 8 years old, and the title of the novel was An Italian Girl, and I think it was like 45 words long. It was really great. But you know, since then I've tried to become a little more sophisticated in my execution, and especially in my research to try to figure out what her real story was. And you know, the story of the accident and why her personality changed was always compelling to me. But as I got older, I realized that there were things that my grandmother remembered that everyone thought she was crazy, but maybe the things that she remembered that people didn't remember were actually correct. So I'm going to tell you a very innocent example that's not in the book. There are some really not innocent examples of this that came out during my research, but when I was 10 years old, she came into my social studies class with me to talk to them about emigration and her experience going to Naples and going on the boat. And my mom came to translate in case she got derailed with language, which often happened. And she did immediately get derailed. Instead of talking about the boat and Naples and the Statue of Liberty, she started talking about worms, bacco or bacchi in Italian. And my mother tried to redirect her a couple times. After the class, she was like, "Ma, why were you talking about worms to these poor people?" And these little 10-year-old kids. And my grandma said, "Well, you asked about life in Italy, where we took care of worms. Bacco da seta, which means silkworms." And my mother's like, I've never heard of this before. What are you talking about? So then she went and asked my Aunt Con, who would have remembered, and she's like, can you tell us about these silkworms? And Aunt Con's like, "Oh yeah, when we were kids, we grew silkworms. It was our only source of income. We did it every year." And this lore had been completely lost from family history. But as it turns out, in Calabria, there was a huge cottage industry of silkworm farming. Only women did it, and it was the only source of income for a lot of women whose men were abroad in the States or lost. They'd never come home from war. And in World War II, this was kind of completely lost to northern factories in like Milan. So my grandmother, in this case, they took this layer off of her brain, and this information was fresh, and she wanted to share it. So, like I said, that's an innocent example of some of the things that she shared after she quote unquote went crazy, that got poo-pooed by other people. And I just have to say that most of the stories she did end up telling that people hadn't heard before turned out to be true. In some cases, unfortunately. So I started to write this book, and it took me a really long time to put all these pieces together, but I did get to go on a fantastic research trip to Calabria, where I saw, among other things, those are those silkworm farming tools. Aren't they really cool? Don't they look like torture devices? They have names in Calabrese, but I've never heard names for them in actual Italian, so I think that they're very regional. The other thing that's great about Italian towns, if you're ever going on a research trip there, is they have really comprehensive records. Even if they tell you the records have been lost, if you keep digging, you'll find them. So this is my great-grandmother's emigration record, which for some reason they kept a carbon copy of in Italy, in her village, so you can find out who left and who came back, because emigration was so two-way. I think a lot of us thought we were leaving and that it was temporary, and then we just couldn't come back. And finally, this is a birth certificate. This is my great-grandfather's birth certificate. As you can see, it's been canceled. So one of the scariest things that I discovered while I was there was that my great-grandfather was a bastard. And this was his original birth certificate that was nullified by the town when he was adopted by his biological father much later in life. And this was one of the things that my grandmother knew after the operation that no one else remembered, and it was one of these very dark pieces of family lore that the more I learned about it, the uglier it got. And I think my mother and her generation were so shocked to learn this. So this is the tip of the iceberg of kind of unpacking this story. And I don't want you to think that this is strictly the story of my grandmother's life. It's not. I had to fictionalize a lot just to tell the story. But I do feel like in this exercise, I was able to get close to this woman who basically, there was a wall between us for almost my entire life. So it's been a really meaningful project to me, and I can't tell you how much it means to be able to share it with other people, especially if it causes anyone at all to maybe reappraise the difficult grandmother they had in their life. Because I just think that a lot of us are used to saying, oh, she was a drunk, oh, she was mean, oh, she left her family. These things that we can sum women of our past up in these one evil little lines. And I hear them all the time, and I just want people to step back for a second and ask why. Why was she a drunk? Why did she abandon her family? Because sometimes the answer is fascinating and tragic, and sometimes she should be redeemed for her choices. So that's all I have to say, but thank you so much for listening to me talk.